The Hollywood sign is a symbol of dreams, but for Broadway star Peg Entwistle, it became a tombstone. Hired to replace the silent film era, she was instead ruthlessly erased by the RKO cutting room. Broken and rejected, she didn't walk the red carpet. She climbed 50 feet up the letter H to die on the very symbol of the industry that betrayed her. From the brutal edit that destroyed her career to the chilling suicide note in her pocket, this is the true story of the final hours of Peg Entwistle. Born Millicent Lillian Entwistle in Port Talbot, Wales in 1908, she was a creature of the theater, forged in the fires of British drama and tempered by a childhood defined by catastrophic loss. Her mother died when Peg was just a child, leaving her in the care of her father, Robert Entwistle. Robert was not an amateur, he was a respected actor and set designer, a man of intellect and artistic integrity who moved the family to New York City in the early 1910s to work on Broadway. He raised Peg in the wings of the great theaters, surrounded by the smell of grease paint, the dust of the velvet curtains, and the rhythmic poetry of Shakespeare. New York City in the Roaring Twenties was the center of the universe, and for a young girl with Peg's sensitivity, it was a wonderland. But the city that gave her a vocation also took her father. In 1922, on a cold, wet evening, Robert Entwistle was crossing Park Avenue when a limousine, driven by a wealthy socialite speeding through the rain, struck him. It was a hit and run. He didn't die instantly. He died later, his body broken, leaving 14-year-old Peg an orphan in a sprawling, indifferent metropolis. This trauma is the key to unlocking Peg Entwistle's psychology. She didn't crumble, she calcified. She was taken in by her uncle, Charles Entwistle, who was also a theater manager, and his wife, Jane. They provided a home, but Peg had already learned the hardest lesson of all. Life is fragile, and happiness is fleeting. She channeled her grief into the only vessel that could hold it, acting. But this wasn't the vanity of a teenager wanting to be famous. It was the obsession of a survivor wanting to be heard. Peg approached acting with the discipline of a monk. She wasn't interested in the vaudeville circuits or the cheap melodramas. She wanted art. By the time she was 17, she was already turning heads in Boston's repertory theater scene. She possessed a quality that critics struggled to define, a sort of luminous melancholy. She was blonde and beautiful, yes, with eyes that were described as wistful violet. But she didn't play the ingenue. She played women with secrets. In 1925, she made her Broadway debut. It was a rapid ascent that would have made other actresses dizzy, but Peg climbed with the sure-footedness of someone who belonged there. She was recruited by the New York Theater Guild, the most prestigious theatrical organization in America. This was the Ivy League of acting. To be a guild member was to be anointed as a serious artist. She shared the stage with legends like Lorette Taylor and George M. Cohan. There is a specific moment in history that proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the sheer power of Peg Entwistle's talent. It happened on a rainy night in 1929. The play was Henrik Ibsen's The Wild Duck, a dense psychological tragedy. Peg was playing Hedvig, the doomed daughter. In the audience sat a young, awkward girl with big eyes and a fierce ambition, accompanied by her mother. That girl watched Peg Entwistle move across the stage. She watched the way Peg used silence, the way she conveyed heartbreak with a mere tilt of her head. That girl in the audience was Bette Davis. Years later, when Bette Davis was the first lady of the American screen, the terrifying queen of Hollywood, she would explicitly state in interviews, "I want to be exactly like Peg Entwistle." She credited Peg's performance in The Wild Duck as the singular spark that convinced her to become an actress. Peg Entwistle was the muse for the woman who would define acting for the 20th century. She was the actress's actress. She had the reviews, the pedigree, and the respect of the toughest critics in New York. By 1929, Peg Entwistle was the it girl of the legitimate stage. She was living in a glamorous apartment, attending dinner parties with the literary elite, and was engaged to a handsome actor named Robert Keith. Life, it seemed, had finally stopped taking from her and started giving. But the universe has a cruel sense of timing. Just as Peg reached the pinnacle of Broadway, the floor fell out from under the world. October 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression rolled over America like a suffocating gray fog, extinguishing the lights of Broadway one by one. The theater is a luxury business. It relies on the disposable income of the wealthy. When the bankers jumped out of windows on Wall Street, the audiences vanished from Times Square. Shows that used to run for years now closed in a week. Theaters were boarded up. The legitimate stage was dying a slow, starving death. Peg fought to hold on. She took roles in plays that paid a fraction of her former salary. She toured the country, playing to half-empty houses in provincial towns. But the economic reality was undeniable. And then the personal tragedy struck again. Her brief marriage to Robert Keith ended in scandal and divorce when she discovered he had hidden a previous marriage and a child, a young boy named Brian Keith, who would later become a famous actor himself. Broke, divorced, and watching her beloved Broadway crumble into dust, Peg Entwistle found herself backed into a corner. By 1932, there was only one industry in America that was still growing, one place where an actor could still make a living: the talking pictures. Hollywood. Peg hated the movies. Like many stage actors of her generation, she viewed cinema as a vulgar, mechanical medium. It was canned acting. It lacked the soul, the immediacy, and the danger of live theater. To go to Hollywood was considered selling out. It was admitting defeat. But pride doesn't pay the rent, and hunger is a persuasive negotiator. In April 1932, a defeated Peg Entwistle packed her trunks. She said goodbye to the gray skylines of New York, the city that held the ghosts of her father and her dreams. She boarded the Super Chief train bound for Los Angeles. She was moving in with her Uncle Charles, who had already migrated west and settled in a small house in the Hollywood Hills. The address was 2428 Beechwood Drive. It was a modest, Spanish-style bungalow nestled in Beechwood Canyon, and looming directly above the house, visible from the front porch, was a massive, blinking advertisement for a real estate development. 13 letters 50 feet high, studded with 4,000 light bulbs that flashed in sequence. Hollywoodland. When Peg stepped off the train at Union Station into the blinding California sun, she felt like an alien. Los Angeles in 1932 was a strange, sprawling frontier town disguised as a paradise. It smelled of orange blossoms and exhaust fumes. It was a city of facades where buildings were made of plaster and people were made of lies. But Hollywood was waiting for her, or so it seemed. The industry was hungry for class. With the advent of sound, the squeaky-voiced silent film stars were being purged. The studios needed actors who could speak, who had diction, who could project emotion with their voices. They needed Broadway training. Peg Entwistle was exactly what the doctor ordered. Within days of her arrival, she secured an audition at RKO Pictures. RKO was one of the big 5 studios, a powerhouse that was currently betting its future on a new, darker kind of storytelling. The executives watched her screen test. They were mesmerized. She didn't look like the typical Hollywood blonde. She wasn't a vamp or a girl next door. She had that wistful violet quality. She had gravity. They offered her a contract. It was a one-picture deal with options for more. To a starving actor, it looked like salvation. To Peg, it looked like a second chance. She signed the papers, believing that her talent, the talent that had mesmerized Bette Davis, would protect her in this new mechanical world. She didn't know that she had just signed her own death warrant. As Peg Entwistle unpacked her suitcase in the bedroom on Beechwood Drive, placing her playbills and reviews from New York on the dresser, she must have felt a strange dissonance. Outside her window, the crickets of the canyon chirped, and the dry Santa Ana winds rattled the window panes. Above her, the sign blinked its mechanical rhythm, Hollywoodland. She was a queen entering a slaughterhouse, armed only with her sensitivity. She believed that Hollywood was a place where talent was the currency. She didn't realize that in 1932, talent was merely a raw material, like celluloid or lumber, to be cut, spliced, and discarded if it didn't fit the frame. She had arrived at the height of the studio system's power, a time when executives were gods and actors were cattle. She brought with her the refined tools of the theater, nuance, pause, subtext, but she was walking into a machine that was built to manufacture noise. The tragedy of Peg Entwistle didn't begin on the ladder. It began the moment she convinced herself that she could survive in a town that had no use for her soul. The stage was set for a collision between art and commerce, and as Peg would soon learn, commerce always holds the scissors. The summer of 1932 in Los Angeles was a season of oppressive heat. The Santa Ana winds blew in from the desert, coating the palm trees in a layer of brown dust, and turning the air inside the unair-conditioned sound stages of RKO Radio Pictures into a stifling oven. It was into this furnace that Peg Entwistle stepped to begin her film career. She had signed her contract, she had the studio pass, she had the new face that the executives were betting on. But from the moment she walked through the heavy iron gates at 780 Gower Street, Peg realized that RKO was not the artistic sanctuary she had known on Broadway. It was a factory. The sound of hammering sets, the shouting of assistant directors, and the mechanical whir of the cameras created a cacophony of commerce. Here, time was money. Every minute of delay cost thousands of dollars. There was no time for rehearsal, no time for finding the character, no time for the deep intellectual exploration that Peg craved. Her vehicle for stardom was a film titled 13 Women. Produced by the legendary David O. Selznick, it was intended to be a high-concept psychological thriller, a precursor to the slasher genre decades before Psycho. The plot revolved around a vengeful half-caste sorceress who uses astrology and hypnosis to systematically destroy the women who had slighted her in boarding school years prior. Peg was cast as Hazel Cousins. It was a significant role, perhaps the most complex in the script. Hazel was a woman being psychologically dismantled. She was a character trapped in a loveless marriage, vulnerable, sensitive, and ultimately driven to madness and murder by the villain's manipulation. For Peg, this was red meat. It was exactly the kind of heavy, dramatic material she excelled at. She approached Hazel Cousins not as a melodramatic victim, but as a tragic heroine in the vein of Ibsen or Chekhov. She threw herself into the role with a terrifying intensity. On set, amidst the chaos of the production, Peg was a quiet storm. She didn't play to the back row, she played to the lens. She used her eyes, those wistful violet eyes that Bette Davis so admired, to convey a crumbling psyche. The early buzz was electric. The dailies The raw footage, developed overnight and viewed by executives the next morning, showed a performance of startling depth. George Archambault, the director, was reportedly impressed. Peg wrote letters home to her friends in New York, her handwriting looping with cautious optimism. She described the grueling hours, the heat, but also the thrill of seeing herself on the silver screen. She believed she was doing good work. She believed she was translating her art to a new medium. But while Peg was pouring her soul into Hazel Cousins, the studio was watching the clock. 13 Women was a troubled production. The script was dense with characters, 13 of them, as the title suggested, and the plot was convoluted. It touched on themes that made the censors nervous: lesbianism, suicide, the occult. As filming wrapped in August 1932, the studio executives sat down to watch the rough cut. This is the moment where art meets the guillotine. The film was too long. It dragged. The test audiences in Pasadena and San Bernardino were confused. They didn't like the heavy psychological drama. They wanted more Myrna Loy, more exotic thrills, and faster pacing. They found the character of Hazel Cousins disturbing. The lesbian subtext between Hazel and the villainess was too overt for 1932 sensibilities. The Hays Code, Hollywood's self-imposed censorship guidelines, was tightening its grip. The studio panicked. They didn't see a nuanced performance. They saw a liability. They saw a downer. David O. Selznick, the man who would later produce Gone with the Wind, made the call. The film had to be cut, and not just trimmed, gutted. The editing room is often called the final rewrite, but in the case of 13 Women, it was a slaughterhouse. The editors took their scissors to the celluloid. They looked at the sprawling narrative and decided to simplify it. The 13 women were reduced to 10. Entire storylines were excised. Peg Entwistle's Hazel Cousins was the primary casualty. Imagine the violence of it. Peg had spent weeks building a character, crafting an arc of descent into madness. She had wept on camera. She screamed. She had delivered monologues of heartbreaking vulnerability. And in a dark room, smelling of glue and acetate, a man with a pair of scissors simply cut her out. Snip. There went the motivation for her suicide. Snip. There went the scene where she confronts her husband. Snip. There went the moment the audience learns why she is suffering. When the editors were finished, Peg's role had been reduced from a co-starring turn to a glorified cameo. She was on screen for approximately 4 minutes. Her character appeared, looked distressed without context, and then was swiftly dispatched. The emotional weight of her performance was gone, leaving only a ghostly, inexplicable presence. But the cruelty of Hollywood is that they don't tell you immediately. They let you wait. Throughout August and early September, Peg sat in her room at 2428 Beechwood Drive. The phone didn't ring. The studio was silent. She had finished her work, and now she was waiting for RKO to pick up the option on her contract. An option is a standard Hollywood clause. It means the studio has the exclusive right to renew your contract for another 6 months, or to fire you without cause. Peg was broke. She had spent her advance on clothes and living expenses, believing that her career was just beginning. She couldn't afford a train ticket back to New York. And even if she could, the shame was a wall she couldn't climb. How could she return to Broadway, the prodigal daughter who had failed? How could she face her peers, the critics, the people who had called her the next great hope of the American theater? Then, the reviews for 13 Women began to trickle in from the trade papers. They were lukewarm, and worse, they barely mentioned her. Variety called the film tedious. The New York Times dismissed it. Peg Entwistle The girl who had once commanded paragraphs of praise from the toughest critics in Manhattan was now an afterthought, a face in the crowd. And finally, the letter came. It wasn't a script. It wasn't a call sheet. It was a standard mimeographed notice from the legal department of RKO Radio Pictures. We regret to inform you that RKO will not be exercising the option on your contract. The reasons whispered around town were brutal. They said she was too intense. They said she lacked sex appeal. They said her face was too intelligent for the camera. In the era of the platinum blonde bombshell, the Jean Harlows and the Mae Wests, Peg Entwistle's dark, brooding sensitivity was a product for which there was no buyer. She was 24 years old. She was an orphan. She was divorced. And now she was a Hollywood reject. The heat wave broke in mid-September, replaced by a thick, clinging fog that rolled in off the Pacific Ocean. The air in Beechwood Canyon grew heavy and damp. Peg stopped eating. She stopped leaving the house. Her Uncle Charles, worried, tried to cheer her up. He told her it was just a setback. He told her there were other studios, but Peg knew the truth. In a town this small, the smell of failure is distinct. Once RKO dropped you, the other studios, MGM, Paramount, Warner Brothers, would see you as damaged goods. She spent her days staring out the window at the sign on the hill. Hollywoodland. The letters were 50 feet high, made of sheet metal and telephone poles. They were ugly utilitarian structures up close, held together by wires and scaffolding. But from a distance, they were a promise that had been broken. On the afternoon of Friday, September 16th, 1932, the silence in the house became unbearable. Peg was alone with her thoughts. The rejection letter from RKO sat on the dresser, a physical manifestation of her worthlessness. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, the face that the camera had rejected, the face that wasn't sexy enough. She made a decision. It wasn't a frantic decision. It was the calm, logical conclusion of a woman who had analyzed her script and realized her character had nowhere left to go. She went to her closet. She chose her favorite dress, a printed silk georgette that fluttered when she walked. It was a dress for a garden party, for a premiere, for a happy ending. She put it on. She didn't put on shoes meant for hiking. She put on her dress shoes. She told her uncle she was going to walk to the drugstore on Beechwood Drive to buy a book and then visit some friends. It was a lie, but it was a gentle one. A lie designed to buy her time. "I'll be back soon," she might have said. She walked out the front door of the bungalow. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the canyon. The crickets were starting their nightly chorus. She turned right, away from the drugstore, away from the city. She turned toward the dirt path that wound up into the brush, toward the sign. As Peg Entwistle walked up the trailhead, she was walking through the wreckage of her own dreams. Every step took her further away from the studio that had fired her, and closer to the symbol that had mocked her. She carried nothing but her purse and a coat. No script, no headshots, just herself. Up on the hill, the sign waited. The maintenance ladder on the letter H was rusted, a treacherous climb for anyone, let alone a woman in silken heels. But Peg wasn't thinking about the climb. She was thinking about the fall. She was about to perform her final scene, and this time there would be no editors. There would be no cutting room floor. This time, the ending would be exactly the way she wrote it. When the coroner's van drove away from Beechwood Canyon on that Sunday morning in September 1932, carrying the broken body of Peg Entwistle, the physical tragedy ended, but the metaphysical one was just beginning. In Hollywood, death is rarely the end of a career. Sometimes it is the only way to secure a legacy. Peg was cremated, her ashes shipped to Glendale, Ohio, to be interred next to her father, Robert. It was a quiet, dignified end for a woman who had sought the dignity of the stage, but found only the indignity of the industry. Her uncle, Charles Entwistle, packed up her belongings, the silk dresses, the playbills from Broadway, the reviews that called her a genius, and closed the door on the room at 2428 Beechwood Drive. But something remained on the hill. Almost immediately, the H on the Hollywoodland sign became a site of morbid pilgrimage. In the 1930s, suicide was a taboo subject, wrapped in shame and silence. Yet Peg's public, theatrical death struck a nerve. It was too symbolic to ignore. She hadn't just killed herself, she had thrown herself off the very symbol of the town that rejected her. It was a final, violent critique of the Dream Factory. As the years passed, the sign itself began to rot further. In 1949, the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce stepped in to repair it. They removed the land, leaving only Hollywood. The sign was repainted, the wood replaced with sheet metal. But locals began to whisper that you can paint over wood, but you cannot paint over trauma. The hauntings began in the 1940s. It started with the park rangers. Griffith Park, the massive urban wilderness that surrounds the sign, is patrolled nightly. Rangers are practical men, used to dealing with brush fires, coyotes, and teenagers drinking beer. They are not prone to flights of fancy, yet report after report began to file into the station logs describing the same phenomenon. A woman, blonde, dressed in clothing from the 1930s, often described as a light fluttering dress. She would be seen walking on the trails near the sign, looking confused or distressed. When rangers approached her to tell her the park was closed, she would vanish, not run away, vanish, dissolve into the mist. And then there was the smell, gardenias. Peg Entwistle's favorite perfume was a heavy floral gardenia scent. It was her signature. In the dry, dusty air of the California canyons, where the only smells are sagebrush and dirt, the sudden, overwhelming aroma of fresh gardenias is impossible to explain. Yet hikers, residents of Beechwood Canyon, and maintenance workers have reported it for decades. A cloud of flowers that hits you out of nowhere near the letter H lingers for a few seconds and then disappears. One of the most chilling accounts came from a couple walking their dog near the sign in the 1990s. Their dog, a golden retriever, suddenly stopped, hackles raised, and began to whine and back away from an empty patch of the trail. The couple felt a sudden intense drop in temperature. Then they saw her, a woman in a period dress, appearing solid, looking dazed. She walked past them, not acknowledging their presence, and faded as she reached the steep drop-off of the ravine. The dog refused to walk on that trail ever again. But the ghost of Peg Entwistle is not just a campfire story. It has seemingly interacted with the very technology of the sign itself. In recent years, the Hollywood Sign Trust installed a sophisticated security system to prevent vandalism and suicides. It includes motion sensors, infrared cameras, and loudspeakers. The system is triggered by movement. Security guards monitoring the feeds have reported numerous instances where the motion sensors on the letter H are triggered in the dead of night. The alarms blare, the lights snap on, the cameras zoom in, and there is no one there, no coyote, no bird, no hiker, just empty air. But the sensors, calibrated to detect the weight and heat of a human body, insist that someone is climbing the ladder. Is it a glitch? Or is it Peg, night after night replaying her final climb, stuck in a loop of eternal rejection? This paranormal legacy has transformed Peg from a failed actress into a Hollywood icon. She has become the patron saint of the broken dreams. Every year, thousands of aspiring actors flock to Los Angeles. They wait tables, they drive Ubers, they go to auditions where they are treated like cattle. They live in cramped apartments, staring at the phone, waiting for the call that will change their lives. For them, Peg is not a ghost. She is a mirror. She represents the terror that lives in the back of every actor's mind. What if I'm not good enough? What if I give everything and it still doesn't matter? In 2014, on the anniversary of her death, a group of film enthusiasts gathered at the Beechwood Cafe for an impromptu memorial. They watched 13 women. They drank a toast to Hazel Cousins. They didn't talk about the suicide. They talked about the performance. They reclaimed her art from the tragedy. But the most poignant tribute to Peg Entwistle isn't a ghost story or a memorial service. It's a song. In 2012, singer Lana Del Rey released the music video for Lust for Life. In the video, she climbs the Hollywood sign. She sits inside the letter H. She smiles. She's wearing a dress that looks suspiciously like the 1930s. It is a direct visual reference to Peg. But in the video, Lana doesn't jump. She slides down the letter laughing. It is a rewriting of history, a fantasy where the girl on the sign gets a happy ending. However, reality offers no such rewrites. Peg Entwistle remains dead. Her career remains cut short, and the letter H remains a somber monument. The irony of her afterlife is suffocating. In life, Peg wanted recognition for her talent. She wanted to be known as a serious actress. Hollywood denied her that. Instead, it gave her infamy. It made her famous for dying. It turned her into a tourist attraction, a spook story for the star tours. On your left, folks, is the famous Hollywood sign, where in 1932, the actress Peg Entwistle. She has become a cautionary tale, a grim warning label slapped onto the package of the American dream. Warning, contents may be fatal. But is that fair? Is it fair to reduce a woman who played Ibsen and Chekhov to a ghost story? To truly honor Peg Entwistle, we must look past the ghost. We must look at the system that created the ghost. The cutting room floor isn't just a place where film scraps fall. It's a metaphor for how the industry treats human beings. Peg was cut because she didn't fit the mold. She was too intense, too intelligent, too New York. In the 1930s, the studio system was a monolith. You either fit or you died. Today, the system has fractured, but the cruelty remains. How many Peg Entwistles are out there right now, scrolling through their phones, waiting for an email, wondering if they are good enough? How many are staring at the sign, feeling the pull of the fall? The scent of gardenias on the hill is not a haunting. It is a reminder. It is the smell of a talent that refused to rot, even when the body was gone. It is Peg saying, I was here, I mattered, and you cannot cut me out of the story anymore. As the sun sets over Los Angeles tonight, the Hollywood sign will light up, not with the bulbs of 1932, but with the reflection of the city lights below. It is beautiful, it is iconic, but it is also a graveyard. Peg Entwistle is the most famous resident of that graveyard, but she is not the only one. She represents the thousands of silent tragedies that built this town, the writers who drank themselves to death, the directors who were blacklisted, the stars who died of overdoses in lonely hotel rooms. She is the queen of the could have beens. And as we prepare for the final chapter of this story, we must ask ourselves a difficult question. If Peg had received that letter from the Beverly Hills Playhouse one day earlier, would it have mattered? Or was the industry destined to destroy her eventually? Was she too fragile for this world, or was the world too brutal for her? The answer lies in the final unseen reel of Peg Entwistle's life. The body of Peg Entwistle was gone. The coroner had done his work, the police had filed their reports, and the newspapers had moved on to the next scandal. The Hollywood sign girl was yesterday's news. But at 2428 Beechwood Drive, the silence was heavy. Her uncle, Charles Entwistle, sat in a house filled with the quiet remnants of a life interrupted. A silk dress, a pair of shoes, a stack of reviews from New York that called his niece a genius. Then the mailman came. It was Monday, September 19th, 1932. Just one day after Peg's body was discovered in the ravine, 3 days after she climbed the ladder. The letter dropped into the mailbox with a soft thud. It was a standard envelope stamped and postmarked from Los Angeles. Charles opened it. His hands must have shaken. The return address was prestigious: the Beverly Hills Playhouse. This was not a movie studio, it was a theater company, a serious, legitimate theater company that staged plays for the Hollywood elite who craved culture beyond the talkies. The letter was addressed to Peg Entwistle. It was an offer. The Playhouse had seen her work. Perhaps they had seen The Wild Duck years ago. Or perhaps they had heard the buzz from the RKO lot before the editors ruined it. They didn't care about sex appeal. They didn't care about the camera angles. They wanted an actress who could carry a heavy dramatic load. They were offering Peg the lead role in their next production. But as Charles read further, the blood must have drained from his face. The cruelty of the universe is not random. Sometimes it feels precise, malignant, and ironic. The play was a tragedy. The character Peg was offered was a young, beautiful, and deeply troubled woman who is driven to commit suicide in the final act. The irony is so dark, it feels scripted. Hollywood had rejected Peg for being too intense for the screen, only to offer her a role that required that exact intensity for the stage. And the role itself, a woman contemplating death, mirrored the very darkness that had consumed her on Friday night. If the letter had arrived on Friday morning, if Peg had waited just one more weekend, if she had checked the mail one last time before walking up the canyon, she would have held that letter in her hand. She would have seen that she wasn't worthless. She would have seen that there was a place for her talent. She would have realized that RKO was just one building in a big city, and that the theater, her first love, still wanted her. She would have taken the job. She would have played the role. She would have channeled her pain into art instead of death. She would have lived. But life is not a movie. There are no last-minute rescues. The letter sat in a canvas bag at the post office while Peg was climbing the ladder. It was sorted while she was falling. It was delivered while she was dead. This is the cruel twist that defines the Peg Entwistle story. It transforms her death from a sad event into a grotesque cosmic joke. It proves that despair is often a matter of timing. Peg died not because she had no future, but because she couldn't see it through the fog of the present moment. In the decades that followed, the legend of Peg Entwistle grew, feeding on this irony. She became the patron saint of the lost. But fame is a double-edged sword. By becoming a symbol of failure, Peg's actual talent was erased for a second time. People forgot about Bette Davis idolizing her. They forgot about her Broadway triumphs. They forgot that she was a skilled, nuanced professional. Instead, she became a caricature, the blonde who jumped, a spooky story to tell tourists on the Starline bus tours. Look up there, folks, that's where she did it. The Hollywood sign, once a billboard for real estate, became a billboard for ambition's cost. Every time the lights of Los Angeles twinkle below, they are mocking the girl who fell. But we must reject that narrative. We must refuse to let Peg be defined solely by her worst moment. Peg Entwistle was a casualty of a system that treats human beings as disposable commodities. The cutting room floor isn't just a place where film scraps fall, it is a mindset. It is the belief that if you can't be sold, you don't exist. RKO cut her out of 13 Women because she didn't fit the formula. They tried to edit her out of history, but they failed because here we are, 90 years later, talking about her. We are not talking about the executives who fired her. We don't remember their names. We don't remember the editors who cut her scenes. We remember Peg. Her tragedy forces us to confront the ugly underbelly of the dream factory. It reminds us that for every star on the Walk of Fame, there are 1,000 bodies buried in the foundation. It warns us that validation from an industry is a fickle, poisonous thing. The ghost of Peg Entwistle, whether she walks the hills as a spirit smelling of gardenias or simply lives on as a warning, is the most honest thing in Hollywood. In a town built on illusions, she is the cold, hard truth. So the next time you see an image of the Hollywood sign, don't look at the white letters. Look at the empty space between them. That is where Peg Entwistle lives. She is the silence between the applause. She is the letter that arrived too late. And she is the eternal reminder that you can cut a woman out of a movie, but you cannot cut her out of the story. Peg Entwistle didn't just die on that sign. In a way, she became the sign. Beautiful, tragic, and forever out of reach.